Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Voice of Authority webinar. My name's Toby Fox. I'm the Managing Director at 3Fox, the marketing agency for councils. And since 2004, we've been running over 30 events a year, bringing councils and the development community together. During lockdown, we've been doing that by organising these weekly webinars. Well, they were weekly. There's a bit of a thirst for information out there, and now we're streaming twice a week. So next Tuesday at 8:30 a.m, we'll host the second of our four-part breakfast time conversation about culture and placemaking, asking how and why are councils, artists, and the development community supporting each other during and post coronavirus. And we'll be back this time next Thursday to look at how the pandemic has accelerated the smart cities agenda. But today we're here with McGeough Evans to discuss how can councils help make development healthy. When people choose where to live and work, well-being competes increasingly strongly with financial considerations as a factor. Meanwhile, the healthcare economy has shifted dramatically from treatment to prevention, encouraging healthy lifestyles and behaviour. So how is health being built into places? Do councils have a significant role to play in ensuring that development and regeneration have healthy outcomes? How can well-being be measured? Can health be a significant aspect of procurement? What's the worth of social value to developers? And how can we be sure it won't be value engineered out? These are some of the questions that we're going to be putting to our panel over the next half an hour. And after that, it's over to you, our viewers. We're hoping that the next 30 minutes of conversation will prompt you, or perhaps even goad you, into using the Q&A function on your screens to set questions and to vote for questions, so that from around 11:30, we can put the most popular questions to the panel. And we'll also be screening some snap polls during the session, mostly simple yes or no questions for you to complete and help feed the discussion and the report that's going to follow this session. Before that, it's up to our panelists to stir you into debate. Will they be provocative? Will they be reassuring? Will they be stimulating? They've certainly been generous in sparing their time to share the wealth of experience with us today. And it's an absolute pleasure to introduce, in alphabetical order, Bethan Harris, who is Director of Collectively, the collective seeking to forward 4 of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which regular viewers may remember we covered this time last week. Also Kevin McGeough, who is Director of Healthy Newtown Programme at Ebbsfleet Garden City, the new settlement being built in Kent. And with them, Matthew Pearce, Head of Public Health and Wellbeing at West Berkshire Council. And alongside them, Jenny Ryden, Partner and Head of Healthcare Sector at McGeough Evans, who are our sponsors today, and for 2 more sessions to come. And I'll take this opportunity to express our thanks to them for that support, which has enabled this discussion to take place. To the discussion, turning to you first, Bethan. Through the work your team has done with the Loneliness Lab, which when practicing this, I found very difficult to say, and it hasn't got any easier, at Collectively, what ideas have been created and tested that developers and local authorities can incorporate into new developments to help tackle social isolation? And how has the pandemic lockdown galvanized those ideas, and what sort of new patterns have emerged?
Yes, thank you, Toby, and hello everyone. So yes, I'm Bethan. I have been working on a project called the Loneliness Lab now for the last 18 months, and the Loneliness Lab was set up really kind of as a direct response to the question that we're talking about today, because lots of local authorities were sort of starting to see that loneliness was becoming a huge sort of public health issue, and local authorities really bearing the cost of loneliness in society, and sort of and having to deal with the kind of fallout of it. Many of us will kind of associate loneliness as a mental health kind of the connection with mental health, but there's also a lot of research that it has a kind of a very strong kind of link to physical health as well, with some statistics showing that it's as bad for us as smoking 16 cigarettes a day. So it's a really big kind of health issue in our society, and it's growing, and particularly growing with COVID. We were approached at Collectively sort of as a response to this question by a global property developer called Lendlease. And they were keen to try and understand how they could support the local authorities that they work with to look at loneliness. And at the time that we started the project, loneliness was really high up the agenda in government. We just sort of had the announcement of a new loneliness minister. There was a lot of discussion about loneliness, but what we found was very few people were talking about the structural drivers of loneliness. So it was very much about befriending schemes, you know, civil society responses. How can we be better neighbours? How can we be better citizens to one another? How can we make sure Marjorie's not on her own? And actually nothing was being done to look at what is driving loneliness in the first place. Like, how are we designing our cities and our urban environments that might actually make people more or less lonely? So when we started the lab, we worked really closely with Berkshire Council, who have a really interesting kind of, they put public health and regeneration in the same team under Professor Kevin Fenton. And we started to look at this question and to explore some of the different kind of connections between our built environment and the loneliness we're facing in society. So we've been kind of working as a kind of cross-sector network since we launched, bringing together community organisations, lonely people, artists, activists, developers, local authorities and architects. And yeah, and in terms of COVID, I think it's really interesting. I think we're really seeing that people's experience of COVID and loneliness in lockdown is really influenced by where you live or the access to public spaces you have and the type of housing typologies you're in. And we're particularly seeing, you know, vulnerable communities, disadvantaged communities, the BAME communities particularly affected by lots of health issues at the moment, but loneliness being one. And also, you know, so sort of it's having a big impact, but also I think as we're coming out of lockdown now, a lot of the spaces where people would have connected with one another before, like shops or cafes, like lots of people who live on their own might have their only interaction in a day in the high street or in a cafe. You know, those spaces are actually, we're really focusing on how we keep people apart, how we make them as safe as possible, and that's important, but we have to also think about what role social function they play as well. So yeah, so that's kind of the work that we've been doing, and I was asked to sort of specifically talk a little bit about the work we're doing at Euston now, so working really closely with Camden Council, Lend-Lease in Euston, and a number of community organisations to really try and understand how we can build in loneliness into the master plan there. So looking to my colleagues at Lend-Lease are kind of leading this work to try and really embed connection into the work that they're doing. So I can talk a bit more about that in the Q&A. I think that's Fantastic. My intro time.
Fantastic, Beth, and thank you very much. And we look forward to coming back to that and examining what the effects of the work that you've been doing have actually been. But before we do that, let's open up the conversation to Kevin at Ebbsfleet and talk about a little, if you would, Kevin, on the design of a place and its services and how that might affect the outcome of how healthy its residents are. I mean, how far can it go in affecting that outcome? And how's the thinking different at Ebbsfleet when it comes to health and well-being? And could some of the things that you're doing perhaps become a blueprint for the country's cities and towns?
Thanks, Toby, and thanks for the invite to come and speak with you today. Obviously, Ebbsfleet's the first of a new generation of garden communities, the first for 100 years, the first new town designated in the UK for 50 years. Personally, I'm a bit of a new town nerd. I grew up in Craigavon, new town in Northern Ireland, which had lots of positives and negatives. And my passion for Ebbsfleet is very much taking some of the good lessons from these new places and avoiding some of the worst lessons. So what's the connection between new places and health? Actually, people don't quite realise, but many of the new towns and garden cities were built in reaction to health issues, actually. 4 of our new places have already been made UNESCO World Heritage Sites. And that's very much a reflection on how good they were and how the UK has led the world in terms of thinking about health and place. For example, if you move from Bradford to Saltire, when it was built in 1861, your life expectancy went up by 50%. There's also been a very strong connection in the new town movement post-war, thinking about health and housing and the built environment. So, for example, the original Minister for Health was the Minister for Housing, and that went on for the first 20 or 30 years. And then there was almost like a 50-year gap when the connection between health and placemaking disappeared. So at Ebbsfleet, we're also really pleased to be one of the 10 Healthy New Town pilot programmes. That's an initiative now led by NHS England to try and rediscover that connection between health and housing, and can we design in better health outcomes to a place from the beginning? And that's the thing we're trying to kind of grapple And we believe there's a very strong connection between the Garden City principles about putting people first, compact neighbourhoods, access to green space, and delivering a healthy new place. And that's what we've been exploring over the last few years. What's different in Ebbsfleet from other new towns? I guess we're a brownfield site rather than a greenfield site. We're an existing neighbourhood, so we're not just about a new place in a green field. We're embracing the existing communities of Swanscombe, Dartford, and Gresham, and we're really trying to make better life outcomes for both the new and existing community in our new place. As a Healthy New Town pilot, however, we're given quite a short radar of what to explore in this. How can we improve health outcomes? We know what it's like for the people living there at the minute, and what we've done through the project was kind of 3 work streams, I guess. Number 1, thinking about how you deliver health services differently. We've designed the health services with people, and I think that's the key to things here. It's co-designing health services, co-designing the built environment, co-designing how it's like to live there with people to make sure we respond to what they do. It's also really important to make sure we try and shape people's behaviour from the beginning when they move into a new place. When you take a new job, when you move to a new house, you all start with great expectations. You're going to change your lifestyle, and that's where we really need to shape that. So we need to have things to do, places to go when you arrive in these new places. Some of the criticism of the early Newtown programs, we used to refer to them as Newtown Blues, but it was loneliness, as Bethan just mentioned. You move to a new place, you can be quite socially isolated. In Ebbsfleet, over the last few weeks, we've done a learning from lockdown survey where we've asked people what it's been like to live in a new place in the current crisis. It's a very different kind of place, living in a development without new facilities or without certain facilities. So again, we can share some of those with people through this conversation, some of the output from that. To date, about 10% of the housing is built in Ebbsfleet, about 2,000 homes. Our ambition is to go up to 15,000. But the other interesting thing about Ebbsfleet is it's going to have 30,000 jobs. And not just any jobs, jobs that are much more aspirational and trying to sort of change what that place is like to live in. In our built environment, we've been working with our developers to make sure people have good homes with natural light, ventilation, good access to outdoor space. And those are the things that people really valued through this lockdown process. We as a development corporation are also going to build 7 new city parks, 200 hectares of green space. That's more than double the original ambition of the early garden cities. Not just any new park, we've actually run a landscape design international competition with the NHS, which had a huge amount of interest from around the world. The winning entry of that had 500 million social media views, which really gives you a sense of how people are interested in health and built environment. And because of that, our developers are also very interested as well. So because the developers can see value in health, they can see value, people have been interested in this, that they're willing to sort of improve their homes and improve their delivery processes as well. So again, just a final sort of point from me. From our survey recently, 95% of people in our survey said that they think how they live and work will change in the future. And over 70% of them said that they really understand now the link between where they live and their health outcomes. So that's something really interesting for us to build on moving forward.
When was that survey taken, Kevin?
It closed last Monday.
Okay, so during the pandemic.
Yeah, so it was kind of called a learning from lockdown survey. We asked people what it was like to live in Ebbsfleet during this period. We had a fantastic response rate from them. Asked them what it was like in their homes, what it was like in their neighbourhood. A really interesting thing was the sense of community enablingness that people valued more than other things. And we're going to use a lot of this information to help change how we plan the place moving forward. As I said, about 2,000 homes are built, but another 13,000 homes have to be built in the future. So this information is really going to help us replan the place moving forward. And as I said, although we're a new place, this is still very useful information for existing places. We work very closely with Kent County Council, Dartford and Gresham, and we're working not just as a new town, but as an existing place as well.
Yeah, well, I very much hope we can help promote the findings in that survey in the next issue of Ebbsfleet Garden City magazine, which 3 Fox has been producing very happily for the last sort of 2 or 3 years. And it has been fascinating watching how these ambitions become reality on a brownfield site. So yeah, fascinating story, and watch this space for lots more. But in the meantime, Matthew, health and well-being are at the very top of your priority list during a pandemic. Is that likely to feed into future schemes in the area, allowing health to become a sort of central principle for development and growth? And internally in the council, what are the kind of key challenges in how your department and others interact and how will they be overcome to improve sort of health and well-being and make sure that the priorities stay high on the list?
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, so rightly said, I think at the moment, health and wellbeing clearly at the top of the priority list. And I think local authorities, so I lead a public health team in West Berkshire, we're very much dealing with both a response and a recovery phase at the moment, which clearly brings a number of challenges. First of all, in terms of dealing with the short-term consequences of COVID, but we're also thinking about how we actually rebuild our communities and restart the economy. So it's very much about how do we create that space to both respond and inform the wider council agenda and create healthy communities. I think the climate change agenda absolutely is really pushing council priorities towards a more healthy, sustainable environment. So many councils are moving to carbon neutral ambitions by 2030. And this is really helping shift a kind of a social movement towards that way of thinking. And as a result of that, many of the local authorities are developing their environmental strategies. So this started before COVID-19, but what COVID-19 has done is almost shone a light on the importance of health and well-being, but also how the environment around us actually shape our outcomes. There's also a report that was published, well, yesterday, a couple of days ago and a week ago from Public Health England about the disparities in COVID-19 from Public Health England, which kind of looked at age, ethnicity, socioeconomic status. So groups are being disproportionately affected from COVID-19. And again, that's kind of raising right to the top of the agenda how important health is and how we can look after ourselves and our communities, particularly as many local communities are setting up community support hubs. I think importantly, public health still has a central role to play about how we support the development in terms of how we translate the evidence base, how we utilise the epidemiology, how do we look at the health outcomes and the consequences from COVID, and how we can use that data to improve health and well-being. So we're already seeing, I think there's about a 17% global reduction in carbon emissions since April across the world. And we know that there's some evidence about a correlation of people that have COVID and air quality in Italy. So there's some really good data coming through that actually help develop that business case to support and embed healthy developments. I think some of the key challenges, as I've talked about, within local government themselves, I think Bethan talked a little bit about how public health was based within regeneration. I think that's really important. Where is public health based within the local authority so that it can actually influence and work with planners to develop these healthy communities? I think there is a risk that with the downturn in the economy going forward, it might be intuitive for councils to focus on infrastructure that favours cars and that type of technology. But I think we need to utilise the evidence and the value for money evidence that we've got on things like active travel and how we can use things like the heat tool to actually put forward a business case to say that active travel is really important, not just in terms of promoting and encouraging social distancing, but also actually the benefits that brings to the NHS, the wider care system, and reducing demand. I still feel we've got some way to go to make that case, particularly to the public as well, because I think the public tend to think quite upstream in terms of lifestyle behaviours, but actually we know it's the wider determinants that actually drive health inequalities and health. One of the things we're doing in West Berkshire is thinking about how we can get public health firmly embedded within planning policy. So actually putting public health specialists within our planning teams, so they can be that conduit, they can be that go-between between the planning and health environments, they can learn the different languages and support one another. And the other thing we're trying to do is think about the health in all policies agenda. So can every policy that goes through the council, they need to think about what might be the health implications of that policy. And we're also thinking that in terms of climate change in the environment. Public health has suffered quite significant cuts to our budget over the last 5 years. We clearly can't do it all. So how can we work across departments to create capacity, knowledge transfer, so that others really recognise how epidemiology, evidence and data can inform planning decisions? I think going forward, there are some opportunities around walking and cycling. We're seeing the government putting a lot of money now into active travel. And again, we need to make sure that the interventions they put in place are sustainable and they're also evidence-based in terms of we are actually evaluating the impact of these. We need to make sure that we are enforcing good practice. I think one of the key things for me is that we've just done a survey from our residents in West Berkshire as part of our COVID response, and about 4,000 residents, and we found that 34% of residents said that they will work from home more following the pandemic, and 40% of those residents said they would travel by car less over the next 6 months compared to the last year. And then 47% said they would travel on foot over the next 6 months compared to next year, compared to last year. So I think already the public are starting to realise and change their behaviours, and it's how we can support that going forward. I think finally, the other thing I'd like to echo and kind of reinforce is how we embed behaviour science into the development of new communities and existing communities. So just creating the infrastructure there to encourage people to be healthy is really important, but how do we motivate them? How do we give them those opportunities? How do we create the capability and capacity for them to take advantage of those situations? So I think the behaviour science element is really important. It's not just giving people the information, it's actually encouraging and making them aware of the benefits.
Fantastic, Matthew. Thank you very much. So we've got behavioural science being embedded into council policy. We've got health officials joining planning teams. We've been talking a bit about loneliness and isolation in new developments from Bethan, and designing health into new settlements from scratch from Kevin. So now to Jenny. What does the citizen expect from local authorities now, Jenny, when looking at healthcare and public well-being? Do local authorities have a crucial role to play in ensuring regen and development produces healthy results?
Absolutely, and if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen, if that's okay, just for a couple of slides, and hopefully this works without too much of a technical hitch. For those who need to, you can minimise your speaker view so you can see more clearly the slides. There's only a couple, so don't worry. But Toby, to answer your question, I'd like to illustrate it with a story, if I may, and take us all to the year 2030. And I ask you all to picture this scene. There's capacity across our acute healthcare system as we're preventing ill health rather than just treating it. The amount of people suffering from long-term conditions is down from 26 million to a more manageable level, and more people than ever are celebrating their 100th birthday. Positive health and wellbeing behaviours are no longer fashionable or Instagrammable, but inclusive, and whole communities have improved together, making the most of the space that they occupy. Prioritising our physical, mental and emotional health is part of our daily life. It's accessible at the most convenient of times and embedded with technology where required. Citizens are actively participating in the development of decisions, and organisations work with aligned values, collaborating across blurred boundaries. Both the public and private sector are measured on how they contribute to reducing health inequalities and increasing social value against the triple bottom line. Now back to present day, and it's needless to say that we are presented with some barriers that prevent us from getting to that utopian state, although we have made huge inroads towards ensuring health and wellbeing attributes are considered in development, and my panellists have all attested to that this morning. We still find significant health inequalities across the UK and markedly different experiences between towns, and a recent report from the Bennett Institute, for example, demonstrates this by suggesting people living in the most deprived towns will live on average 12 fewer years in good health than our wealthiest. That's 12 additional years of drawing down from the care system. So that supporting this is a growing body of evidence to demonstrate that environmental factors do underpin some of these inequalities, such as lack of open space, poor quality housing, and abundance of fast food outlets. So to move towards a vision of the future, and this is a snapshot rather than an exhaustive list, but firstly, improving our understanding of who we're designing for and their changing needs. Take offices, for example, even before the current pandemic, gone were the days of fixed desks and single room offices, and a move to more collaboration spaces, a sense of creativity, caring, and the opportunity to pop to the gym at lunch. Very much learning actually from Kevin's lockdown survey, I think. Secondly, we need to map all of the community health assets we have, which yes, would be physical spaces and facilities, but also the less tangible skills and knowledge in the community, friendships, network, local community groups that make up a community health asset database. Thirdly, adopting more system thinking approach, and Bethan alluded to this with regards to the Loneliness Lab, thinking about encouraging interdependencies and looking at systems at a holistic manner. We're actually doing some work in Slough at the moment where we're working to ensure the regeneration not only improves the town centre but connects peripheral communities, enabling them to thrive. So the new tiny shiny town centre isn't daunting and can work for everyone. We need to define what social value means to us, in my view, and how it will be measured. And this doesn't just account for how much litter we pick up on the side of the road, but also how we genuinely contributed to well-being, productivity, or positive environmental outcomes throughout that course of the development, not only in the early stages, but beyond its foreseeable future. And finally, we should maximise the opportunities through mutual beneficial public-private partnerships that creates empowerment in communities. And another example is where we're working with a group of local residents, currently co-producing a commercial and design strategy for 900 homes and the High Street Regen for Customs House. And again, my panellists have already outlined some more examples of where this co-production is being really successful, showing how we're positively benefiting from bringing these end users together earlier on into the development life cycle and enabling people to actively take responsibility for their own health outcomes.
Fantastic. Jenny, thank you very much indeed. And thank you for being the latest in an increasingly long line now of Montague Evans presenters with fantastic slides.
You're welcome.
You guys are setting new benchmarks in this niche business. Thank you very much to our panel. What a panel. Where are you going to hear a better, more concise, more thoughtful presentation on a more timely topic than that? That was absolutely fantastic. And you've stirred our audience into life. The questions are coming in and there's some cracking questions. So we're going to move on now to the second half of the session and start responding to our viewers. And we're going to start with something from a regular viewer, Mike Diath. It's good to see you there, Mike. Mike asks whether or not the panel agrees that build to rent and co-living offer a real potential for tackling loneliness and home working through great design for living in shared amenity and workspace environments. And I put it to the panel that there's a real a friction there between co-living as a way of overcoming loneliness and co-living as a sort of way of communicating pandemics across large populations. So let's go around the panel as we did and start with Bethan. Bethan, what's your view on sort of co-living spaces?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and actually there's another question in there about I think the example of Ealing of people moving from one sort of type of housing to another type of housing and that causing loneliness. And it's sort of, I think the two are kind of combined actually, because I think, you know, what we've seen with the Loneliness Lab, particularly when we started working in Southwark, was that we'd speak to people who'd lived in one type of social housing and had moved to a new type of social housing. And even though most of the characteristics of their new flats were much better, like much better heating, insulation, all of those sorts of things, what they had found is that they never connected with their neighbours. They, you know, there's a woman that we spoke to who'd lived in the community for 25 years, but hadn't, in the 6 months she'd lived in this new block, hadn't interacted, hadn't met a single other person. So I think co-living can give us an opportunity to kind of think about what needs to be private and what could be shared space. And actually, you know, we've had this real kind of, you know, period in our society of individualism where everything is about your little slice of England and everything being your private bit of the world. And, you know, it's like, I remember when I moved into my flat being really disappointed that I didn't have a private garden. And actually I've got a shared garden with 6 neighbours, and it's been an absolute godsend in lockdown, because I've been able to interact and see people where if I'd had my own private space, I wouldn't. So I think co-living and kind of thinking about those things can be really important, and thinking and questioning what needs to be individual and private and what can be public, and if those public spaces, sort of shared private spaces, essentially. Like, what does that look like? What could those spaces be? And I think working from home, that's a really classic area where, yes, you don't need to commute to an office, but actually our research has shown, we've done quite a lot of work on workplace loneliness, the most lonely thing you can do is work from home. And I'm sure many of us are finding after 3 months of working in our spare bedrooms that it's not great for our mental health. So can sort of different models of working mean that, there's spaces to work from home, but with neighbours who are also working from home. And I guess I just would say as well, I think it is good to think about this in the design of new buildings, and as the question suggests, but it's also thinking about how do we retrofit some of this into existing places we're living. So I live on a very typical Victorian street, and during COVID we've got this real sense of community now because of the kind of shared experience we're going through, and there's lots of aspects of kind of co-living that are kind of bubbling up on the street. We've got like a shared swap box where everyone puts their books in and shares toys and shares craft and stuff across the street. So kind of what can we, can we see a street as a co-living space actually, and think about what can we retrofit and design into a street that allows and facilitates more collaborative ways of living as well.
Yeah, I've got a friend who is constantly asking, a friend and neighbour who's constantly asking, is it really necessary for all of us to own lawnmowers?
Exactly.
And that kind of thing. Actually, I'm going to change the order slightly and come straight to Matthew on this question. Matthew, as a public health official, what's your view of sort of co-living, given that we're in a pandemic and we're practicing social distancing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, obviously, yeah, co-living would potentially bring a number of risks, I guess. With the pandemic, and extra precautions would need to be made. I think, on a whole, I think co-living, is a positive thing. I think, the panel have already talked about the consequences of loneliness. We know the health risks associated with that. I guess I just wanted to pick on what Bethan was saying about retrofitting kind of older areas. I think that's really important, because that's largely where most of the health inequalities are, in those older environments, where people are, they tend to die earlier, they have poor quality of life. So kind of how can we retrofit those areas? But yeah, it's certainly, something we need to think about. And if there are COVID cases, we would have to review kind of those co-living arrangements and do contact tracing, and every situation is different. But I think co-living can only be a positive thing. But again, we have to listen to what the public want and the community wants. Again, there's no point in building things that people don't want. So we need to make sure it works for everybody.
Great, thanks, Matthew. Kevin, you're right at the coalface of that. You're building things that people want. You're creating a town out of nothing. Where does co-living fit into your picture?
I think both build to rent and co-living part of this wide range of housing opportunity. I'm a huge fan. I think we need to differentiate between co-living and build to rent, as in, I think they're both common insofar as they've shared spaces, but I think people who go into co-living have a very mental consciousness of wanting to live in a self-supportive way. So people who move into co-living spaces want to share facilities, and they want to actually get involved with their community, whereas people living in build to rent may be there for a shorter period of time, and they probably value having shared facilities, but it's not necessarily a new way of life which they've moved into, which tends to be more what the co-living is. I'm really quite excited, actually. We've been working in Ebbsfleet with the Kent Co-Housing Group, who've been sort of leading nationally in terms of some thinking in this area. We'd love to see one of the first co-housing, or the first co-housing scheme in Kent to be in Ebbsfleet, and we're trying to work with that group to try and facilitate that. I've also led something called the Happy Report in the past, which was about housing our ageing population, palliative renovation. I'm pleased to say that two of the schemes that have come out of that report over the last few years, Marmalade Lane in Cambridge and Ouch in Barnet, both co-housing schemes, also won the Housing Design Awards as the best designed new housing schemes in the country, not just for co-housing, not just for older people, not for the best housing schemes nationally were co-housing schemes. And anyone who goes to visit these schemes just realizes how good the quality of life in those places are. They're not for everyone, but they certainly should be part of the solution, I think.
Fantastic. Would you echo that, Jenny? And does that sort of resonate in all the different areas that Montague Evans is working in?
Absolutely, yeah, I would echo that, and I think there's opportunities and challenges presented with that particular offer. And one of the points I just wanted to go back to, I suppose, is really understanding our end users and really making sure that we've captured those user profiles or descriptions that not only meet their requirements now, but also in the future. And we've been talking about the sort of co-living offer in response to the COVID pandemic, but obviously we need to future-proof what that might look like and future-proof our workspace environments for what that might look like when we come out of this current situation. And it's a bit of a moving target trying to understand what we all need and our requirements, but getting better understanding of that and determining really is co-living what people want and how are they going to participate in a co-living environment, or are simple tweaks or slight changes to the environments that we've got going to take us on that journey even further. So I'm interested in maybe taking it back a step and really getting under the skin of what's driving that particular sort of ambition.
Matthew, yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to come back in about, obviously we just need to think about the whole demographic changes, don't we? And I know Jenny talked about multi-morbidity, people are going to have, significant frailty going on, aging demographics. And again, it's, that's where co-living probably will be really beneficial, I think, in terms of how we then create those environments to support the older generation. And I just think that's going to be really, really important. So, yeah, I think that's an important point to make.
Great stuff. Thanks, Matthew. And Mike, I hope you've got plenty of material for whatever report you're working on now from that. Now, our viewers are very keen on case studies, on practical examples of what they can take from this session and actually implement in their own areas. So, Bethan, I know that you've got some great examples of the work you've been doing in Camden. Do you want to share some of those examples of where sort of health and development have delivered positive outcomes?
Yeah, sure. And just to just to be clear, this is work that the partners from the Loneliness Lab, so we're a kind of network of organisations, and I sort of run the network, but this very much being led by people kind of who are based in Camden and placed there. And one of the initiatives that is really exciting, actually, it kind of speaks a lot to what Matthew was saying about kind of the behavioural science and empowerment side of this, is that in Camden, there's a new initiative, so using kind of meanwhile use space just behind the British Library. A group of organisations came together, so Camden Council, Lend-Lease, who are the kind of developing the master plan, local community organisations, and then Central St Martin's is a design school. So again, speaking to what Jenny said about partnerships and kind of working across different things, have worked together to set up a makerspace in the heart of kind of a sort of very sort of deprived communities within Camden, to enable community-led design ideas to kind of be developed with the community. So, for example, we've just been doing a piece of work as part of the Loneliness Lab there. So we brought together people from within the community, within that area, to understand what kind of loneliness meant for them, how it was showing up in their experience, kind of what the different sort of aspects of loneliness were. And we ran workshops with the community to understand kind of what would help them connect more with one another, and what could help facilitate connection in the local area. And with the community, so this has all been a bit on hold with COVID, because it's been hard to kind of get people into a makerspace. But what we're now doing and hoping to do as soon as we can is then to start to build some of those ideas with local communities, so that so if there was an idea around just having, it was called a curiosity cabinet, where people could kind of leave things that kind of represented kind of their kind of community in a box, and there would be different things going on in that box every day. And what they were going to do is then build that prototype with members of the community, so they would get involved in kind of building it and then test that out into their communities. So that's a really nice initiative. So that's that space enables Camden and the local authority there and Lend-Lease to really understand what's going on in the community, what could help. Very quickly, very cheaply, and in a very collaborative way, to build those ideas and test them in spaces and places around the borough, And then importantly, what we're interested in is then what design features can we learn from there that can then be put into the future master plan and kind of to sort of design these spaces. So so that's a really, really sort of simple, cost-effective initiative. And I think it's just a really nice example as well of like building on what you have in your own, you know, there's so much, you know, I'm very passionate about civil society, and that's my background. There's so much in civil society, so much talent, so much energy, so much passion in a community, and people that can help solve problems. I think the fact that you've brought this sort of design expertise of Central St Martin's together with the local authority, together with the community organisations who've got the relationships on the ground, it's just a really brilliant way of bringing people together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there may be a lot more of it. I'm speaking from a sort of position of white middle class privilege, with a lifestyle that involves plenty of travel and working in offices and meeting other people all the time and spending time in different environments. It's interesting how lockdown has focused my attention very much more on my street, the local park, the local community, how the world has got much smaller, very, very quickly. And how initiatives like those that you're describing suddenly sort of take on a new life. You can see how vital and important and useful and helpful they might be. And I wonder if that's sort of rippling out through all sorts of new demographics at the moment as well. Jenny, are there any examples that you'd like to pick up on and highlight in terms of the ways that health has been built into development?
So I have the benefit of working predominantly with the NHS, whereby actually most, if not every example, you can genuinely attribute to healthy outcomes and improving accessibility to kind of healthcare services. I suppose one of the points I wanted to reference was taking it back to what I was talking about, systems thinking. And I'd be very interested perhaps to learn how many colleagues on the webinar this morning have been part of a One Public Estate programme or development programme, and looking at how the various different public and indeed private sector organisations can come together and work collaboratively, co-locate, sharing that type of space in a particular development, and achieve improved healthcare outcomes. And I've recently worked with One Public Estate and trying to really unlock that potential more going forward, and actually challenge the boundaries around that. So not only co-locating perhaps some back office accommodation, but really thinking about where patients or citizens or customers or end users are going to come together and share collaborative, share that sort of customer contact perspective in one location, and learning lessons from how they can co-locate. Interestingly, where you then overlay perhaps blue light or emergency services into those potential developments. We've seen numerous amount of examples of that across the UK where it's worked really successfully, but I would also hesitate to say a lot where we probably haven't taken it far enough. And I would say, challenging ourselves to really think about the totality of health and well-being and how it could be brought into developments by perhaps thinking outside the box and challenging some of that status quo.
Fantastic. Okay, so viewers, do let us know if you've been involved in any of those projects. Okay, so panel, feel free to refer to case studies of examples of successfully integrating health into development as we come round. But also, I'd like to broaden the conversation a bit and ask about measuring well-being. So there's this issue of how can it be measured and usefully, and should it be measured? One of the questions our audience is asking is, should developers be forced to measure well-being when they're submitting bids, when they're looking for planning permission? Should local authorities be insisting on well-being measures, and what form might those take? Matthew, have you got any experience or any thoughts on that?
A few, and it's not a straightforward answer. I think the first thing is, what do we mean by well-being? I think that's one of the critical answers we need to get to, because well-being means different things to different people. I know what works well-being, that they've done a lot of work in this area, and I know we are in West Berkshire thinking about how we create a community resilience index. So we're thinking about actually how can we bring together a composite of different measures that might articulate what well-being means, down to a local super output area, down to about 1,500 houses, that can then give us a kind of a benchmark and a means to kind of measure community resilience and how the communities are feeling. So that could cover things like loneliness, connectivity, just mental well-being. But it's not straightforward because a lot of data doesn't go down to that geography sometimes. So it's a really difficult question, and there's lots and lots of different well-being tools out there that have been validated. Some are long, some are short. So, but I know What Works Wellbeing have looked into this. I don't know whether any of the other panels have some experience on how they're kind of thinking about that. But it's not a straightforward one, that's for sure.
Kevin, have you got some experience of that?
Yeah, and in terms of your case studies as well, Toby, I would sort of suggest people have a look at, believe it or not, on the NHS website. On the NHS's website, all the output from the Healthy New Times has been collated into something called Putting Health into Place, or their FIP guidance. So there's a whole series of documents actually that have fantastic case studies from across the 10 Healthy New Time pilots. There's a whole section looking on design and services and the health and wellbeing hubs. There's a whole section about the built environment and how people try to do that. And really important, there's a whole section about community building and what kind of things you can do with the community to help them help themselves to improve their health behaviour. And I think that's really important because, to me, well-being can't necessarily be measured in a black and white way because it's about people's personal satisfaction with their place. So how good do people feel living in that place, which will differ from individuals. So I think you can have a framework for evaluation, but one thing we found is, you get many universities involved in trying to measure things, and you can go to nth degrees, but sometimes it's a long-term measurement, and a lot of these studies are always short-term. I would really struggle to see how a developer could demonstrate that we're going to design for well-being. However, they could demonstrate that they're providing opportunities for people to get involved in their environment. I think equally importantly, involved in what the place is going to be like. So that local governance, stewardship, managing spaces, allowing people to get involved in managing spaces, that's really important. That often gets forgotten about, particularly in new development. So that's really important. So I think it's really important to focus on what people value and how they get involved in their place, rather than getting into figures and just, as we've already heard, there's lots of other measurement tools out there. But do they change what it's like for the people to live in the place? Again, in the Putting Health into Place guidance, there are some interesting approaches that have been taken to try and measure that. So again, I would kind of encourage people to look at those as well.
Fantastic, thanks, Kevin. And we'll try and make sure to put the links to that in the report that will accompany the video of this session, which will be available on voiceofauthority.co.uk shortly after the session ends by the end of the day. Jenny, would you like to pick up on that? I mean, you're a sort of multidisciplinary agency. Are you promoting? Do you have a product or a service that you're offering to clients where you'll measure well-being outcomes of schemes?
To reiterate the comments from my panelists, it's an incredibly complicated topic, and I think actually quite embryonic. There isn't what I determined to be a definition that we could all choose to sort of abide by, because it's so subjective and not a one size fits all. And typically, and I'm sure we're all sort of victims of this, falling into the trap of quite restrictive procurement exercises, which look to measure how our social value contribution is at a corporate level. And I know we at McGeough Evans have really been exploring how you unpack that and think more broadly about social value contribution at a community level, or essentially through partnerships. So my presentation, I talked about litter picking. That's not to diminish the value of litter picking, but thinking bigger as to how, if we were to work in partnership in these potential development opportunities, the power of the collective is so much greater when we could come together and really talk about health and well-being at the instigation of a development opportunity and all the way to the very end. Unfortunately, if I'm honest, and hopefully I can be, we aren't there yet. We're not really being able to capture this because there isn't a particular measure, and we're not being able to necessarily articulate ourselves how well we can demonstrate health and well-being across our entire market, because we haven't got the sort of simplistic tools right. But I definitely think we're getting there, and we're on a journey, and you can see just by the volume of noise in the market that it's so important, and we've got to get it right.
Thanks, Jenny. Bethan, what's your experience of working with organisations like Lend-Lease? So are they building these measures into how they look at the value of their schemes?
Yeah, it's echoing what everyone said really with loneliness. I mean, there's a lot of work that's being done and sort of led by groups like What Works, Wellbeing, and ONS around how you kind of standardise measurement around loneliness. I think, and you know, certainly with working with Lend-Lease, it's you know, and I know it's something that they're looking to, you know, how they understand it on all new projects and kind of how they can kind of embed loneliness as a kind of concept in. I think it's very difficult when it comes, you know, because yes, we do need to evaluate, we do need to learn, we do need kind of data to help inform future direction. But I have done a lot of work with corporates in the sustainability space over the years, and I do worry that the kind of overly sort of obsession on metrics and measurement leads to kind of an obsession on targets, and actually these are quite complex issues. And actually I'm more heartened by the fact that there's like 30 to 40 people I know within Lend-Lease who are sort of deeply looking at the questions of like, how does loneliness actually, you know, how does the built environment really kind of relate to loneliness, and kind of understanding the nuance of that, and really importantly understanding that in a very place-based setting. So we've got a network across Lend-Lease that we work with who are embedded in the places that they're working at. So the team at Euston, or the team in Southwark, or team in kind of in Stratford, and I'm more heartened by the fact that they're sort of asking deep questions and like taking the time to really understand these than there's like somebody in the sustainability team has sort of slapped a target on, you know, how many connections you can make a year or something, you know. So I think it is, yes, we do need data, we do need those metrics, but I think we need to acknowledge these are complex problems. And so I think if I was a local authority wanting to work with a developer, if I was a developer wanting to work with a consultancy, which is, you know, what's happening at Euston, is like choosing to work with partners who are proving that they want to know how, really understand how things are working, and kind of sit with that complexity and kind of invest in the time into understanding it more.
Yeah, a very, very common sense response, Bethan. Thank you very much indeed. Okay, let's turn to a question from John Anderson, who's asking how we manage to pay for shared space and facilities and the other things we need to build in order to promote well-being, particularly as local authority revenue is going to be under increasing pressure. I'm quite sure how much more pressure it could come under, but presumably it's not going to get any easier, Matthew.
Yeah, I'm not sure I know the answer. I'm not sure I know the answer to that one, because I sit in public health, not necessarily planning. What I do know, as I said, is, you know, I think local authorities will be in quite a tricky position financially. So I don't know the kind of intricacies of how we might be able to fund that. So I'm hoping one of my colleagues on the panel might be better placed to answer.
Kevin, do you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most important issues, actually. So it's not just how we're going to manage the shared space, but it's also who's responsible for curation of civic life in a new place, or helping people have things to do and places to go. I think the only way to do that is it needs to be integral to planning at the very earliest stage. I mean, so often developments are getting planning permission with community facilities, and then they have to find a solution at the end of it. The solution inevitably is that they're service charging people for that. So in effect, people who move to the place are having to pay for managing the place themselves, and then obviously they're trying to reduce the costs over time. I think if it's integral to the planning system from the beginning, and in the same way you put contributions to health or other things, there needs to be this understanding of stewardship and the long-term governance of the place, and there has to be funding in place from that that's taken from the original land value. It's too late post-planning, and it's too late when a building's built or a space is built to try and think about how you fund it. It needs to be there from the beginning, really, and it's incredibly important. We really need to think about it much more logistically.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a point was raised earlier about the importance of data in all this. I think Matthew raised it, and the lack of data that we need. And we've got a session coming up on how local authorities can actually access data that is being produced, and there probably is data out there that would be helpful. And exactly the same with you, Kevin. Jenny, what's your view on sort of local authority funding and the ability to pay for things that are actually going to make places better?
I mean, well, to reiterate the comments, what a challenge, but also I suppose recognizing the opportunity on the other side of that, and you know, how do we plan and understand the exact requirements of these particular spaces, which needn't be, you know, excessive, very expensive solutions, and could just more be around spaces in and around developments which would have been developed, designed in already, slightly sort of tweaked or focused around perhaps a community space, and you know, really understanding what the occupation of these particular spaces is going to be. And we're currently working on a particular development in Finchley, which will all be around homes for NHS staff, and through the design of that, at the very early stages, it's keeping the end user at the very, very heart of all the decisions we're making, and recognising that NHS staff tend to work shifts and they tend to have very different work patterns. So driving the design around that sort of user profile to make sure spaces are well lit, shared facilities are practical, and they're not just typically you know, a laundry room or things that might not meet those requirements. So I mean, it doesn't really answer your question, but really trying to understand the requirements from that very early stage for the end user, and build that into the early stage of the planning, like my colleagues have also attested to, will help unlock those potential opportunities to pay for it going forward.
Yeah, I think that plays into something that Libby Kemp, one of our viewers, has been. Well, it's not so much a question as a point she's making about the different populations and how you populate a place in order to make sure that that loneliness isn't a result of different work styles and lifestyles. Matthew, having thrown you the wobbly of the question, I guess your response emphasises the importance of bringing public health and planning together, actually, and feel free to give me a wave if you'd like to come back on this. But I'm gonna throw it over to Bethan. Bethan, presumably your private sector partners have been paying for all of these initiatives that you've been describing for us. Is there any reliance on the local authority financially, or do we have to rely on the private sector to pay for all this?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the example that I talked about with Make, meanwhile, which is the makerspace in Camden, my understanding is that that's a kind of partnership between Camden Council, Lend-Lease, and Central St Martin's, who've equally kind of funded it. But yes, there's obviously kind of a strong role in the work that we're doing on the Loneliness Lab, looking at the role of the private sector here. I think it's understanding that some of these places are going to get built anyway. So, you know, I think that's when you're looking at things like housing design, it's, you know, if we're building blocks of housing, like there's subtle changes that we know from the research that we've looked at that can make a real difference in how people are able to connect with their neighbours and have a sense of belonging in a space. Likewise, you know, if you're creating public spaces, there can be often very subtle things that can make a difference. But it is, I mean, it's really challenging. I think the thing that I always, and it might sound like a simplistic response, but it's like the public sector's paying for this somehow anyway. You know, my husband's a GP, and they are massively burdened with the epidemic of loneliness. Like, so many people just, you know, either because of the health problems or the fact that they go to their GP, because that's the only kind of contact that they'll have. So the public sector's paying for this anyway. I think it's just having a better understanding of how we can reduce those costs through design and kind of through sort of systemic interventions, as Jenny was saying. So, I mean, I know that's not, you can't wave a magic wand and get everyone to think differently, but I think acknowledging that and having more joined up approaches across, you know, so local authorities, if that's regen and public health, working closer together, or, you know, it is like heartening to see on the loneliness agenda that, you know, there is a kind of cross-departmental approach to this, and starting to recognise that these things are more interconnected. So hopefully that will help with kind of financing. But I do also want to just say, as the kind of role of the private sector is, you know, there's a lot of underutilised private space that is in kind of commercial hands at the moment. So offices don't get used in the evenings. The way we design office lobbies could you know, very small changes could mean that the community could use those spaces. I know we can't have communities running around confidential areas in an office, but those massive empty office lobbies that are just there to make your organisation look important could actually be, you know, designed in ways that those could be community spaces in the evening without anyone getting into your confidential spaces. So I think that there should be a bit more of an emphasis on that as well.
Fantastic. Food for thought there, Jenny. Bethan, thank you very much. Matthew, did you want to come in?
Yeah, it's just quick.
And 30 seconds, please.
Oh, yeah, no, it's very quickly. I think, yeah, public health probably has a role in terms of how we can develop the health economics approach, how we can measure kind of that return on investment, which I talked about earlier. So I think there is a role there. It's just creating capacity within public health to support that. But, you know, it's how quickly we get those returns. I think that's a challenge, and where we get that upfront money. And not just public health in a nutshell, is how can we kind of demonstrate that so we get that upfront investment.
Yeah, well said. And the last word to you, Matthew. Fantastic, absorbing discussion, wide-ranging, lots of insights. I hope everyone's been able to take something useful from today. Thank you, panel, for being so lively and engaging in sharing your knowledge with us. It's much appreciated. Please assume with confidence that our audience is applauding you wildly over their keyboards. Thank you to that audience, you, our viewers, for your attention and stimulating questions. As I said, we'll ask our panel to respond to as many of your unanswered questions as possible by email, and we'll post those on our social media channels for you. Meanwhile, you'll find the video of this session at the voiceofauthority.co.uk tomorrow. Thank you, of course, to our sponsors, the excellent McGeough Evans, who made this possible. And don't forget our next session on Tuesday at 8:30 AM, our breakfast session on how and why our councils, artists and the development community supporting each other during and post-coronavirus. Until then, goodbye from our panel, goodbye from me, and goodbye from everyone at 3 Fox. Thank you.